Hello, and welcome to this sneak preview of Hero of Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution, by me, Mike Duncan. I hope you have all pre-ordered the book already, and if you have, thank you very much. This is a sneak preview of what's to come. If you have not pre-ordered the book, this is a sneak preview of what's to come, and hopefully it will induce you to pre-order the book because you like it so much. I did pick what I think is a pretty good chapter. We're not just going to do chapter 1 here. We're actually going to do chapter 4. So we're 60-odd pages into the book by now. But chapter 4 is Lafayette landing in America for the first time. His first impressions of America, America's first impressions of him. We get him landing in South Carolina, then going up to Philadelphia, getting his commission in the Continental Army confirmed, and meeting George Washington, and it takes us through the Battle of Brandywine. All of this is a very nice slice of the early part of the book. Now, since I'm not giving you chapter 1 or chapter 2 or chapter 3, there is just a little bit you need to know before you can pick it up at chapter 4. But chapter 1 talks about how Lafayette's parents both died when he was young, leaving him a very rich orphan. Then chapter 2 talks about how the fact that he was a very rich orphan made him a very eligible bachelor, and a marriage was arranged for him. He wound up marrying Adrienne, who was a part of the great Noailles clan, one of the most important noble families in all of France. But Lafayette quickly discovered he did not really fit in with high society, and he was feeling restless and stifled. And so chapter 3 then talks about how he winds up running away from home to join the Continental Army. So I'm just going to skip over all the details of that because, look, that's all in the book. If you want to get all the details, you pre-order the book. It's very entertaining stuff. You know, he dances with Marie Antoinette and steps on her toes and everybody laughs at him and he can't handle his liquor. You know, the good stuff. Now, as you pick up chapter 4, I think the only person I don't introduce in chapter 4 who you do need to know is Baron Johann de Kalb, who was the facilitator of Lafayette's entry into the Continental Army and who is on the ship that Lafayette sails to America in. Now, de Kalb was working for this guy named Charles-François de Broglie, who thought he was concocting a plot to replace George Washington as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. That's why de Kalb was joining the Continental Army, and it's how Lafayette got roped into it, even though Lafayette didn't actually know about the plan to make Broglie commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Historians call this the Broglie intrigue, and I am giving away too much already. If you want to know more, you got to pre-order the book. But anyway, we are picking up chapter 4 just after they have boarded this ship, La Victoire, and sailed away from France. Lafayette has left quite a bit of chaos in his wake. He did run away from home. He didn't tell anybody he was doing this. Adrienne is crying. His father-in-law is furious. The king is possibly ordering lettres de cachet to toss him in the Bastille. But in April of 1777, they made it. They got away, and Lafayette is on the Atlantic Ocean. And so here now is chapter 4. Chapter 4. Brilliant Madness. Lafayette had never sailed in a ship on open waters. It turned out to be his worst nightmare. He was trapped in confined quarters with no possibility of escape, powerless over a vast ocean that could swallow him whole whenever it wished. But beyond the existential dread, he also suffered from terrible seasickness. During his first week on La Victoire, Lafayette departed his bunk only long enough to vomit. Even after physically adjusting to life on board the ship, Lafayette still suffered mentally. He discovered more than anything else life at sea was tedious and boring. To pass the time, he wrote to Adrienne, "One day follows another here, and, what is worse, they are all alike. Always the sea, always the water, and again the next day the same things." A long stretch of calm winds only prolonged Lafayette's misery. "Since my last letter," he wrote, "I have been in that most tedious of regions. The sea is so dismal, and I believe we sadden each other, she and I." To pass the monotonous weeks of close confinement, Lafayette spent his time reading military manuals and books in English. His only military experience was 2 summers of maneuvers in Metz. He knew he needed to learn more to succeed in America. But his study of English was even more important to his success. The vast majority of French officers presenting themselves to Congress spoke only French. As French was the language of civilized people, they assumed this would not be an issue, much to the consternation of the English-speaking Americans. Lafayette, on the other hand, resolved to learn the language of the people one hoped to serve. If his wealth and title opened the door to America, Lafayette's earnest commitment to speaking English made him truly welcome. Lafayette also became acquainted with his fellow passengers, especially Vicomte de Morrois, the one who convinced him the people of France were behind him. After 15 years in the French army, Morrois rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, but then, like Lafayette, found himself abruptly reformed out of the service by Saint-Germain. His principal object in joining the expedition was clearing a path back to the French army by performing valorous service in America. Morrois shared none of Lafayette's boundless enthusiasm for the Americans or the cause of liberty, which the cynical veteran thought comically misguided. Morrois took a shine to Lafayette, though, and so, from a place of benevolent interest, braced the boy for disappointment. One day at sea, Lafayette said to Morrois, "Don't you believe that the people are united by the love of virtue and liberty?" Morrois replied, "The Americans were not some novel species. They were simply transplanted Europeans, who brought to a savage land the views and prejudices of their respective homelands." He proceeded to give Lafayette a brief moral history of European colonization. Fanaticism, the insatiable desire to get rich, and misery. Those are, unfortunately, the three sources from which flow that nearly uninterrupted stream of immigrants who, sword in hand, go to cut down under an alien sky forests more ancient than the world, watering a still virgin land with the blood of its savage inhabitants, and fertilizing with thousands of scattered cadavers the fields they conquered through crime. This, Morrois informed Lafayette, was the reality of the quote-unquote New World toward which they sailed. Having departed Europe in April, La Victoire was still at sea in June. Uncooperative winds extended the long voyage, as did the decision to avoid Caribbean ports where arrest warrants might be waiting and head straight for Charleston, South Carolina. Eventually, the passengers saw birds, the unmistakable harbinger of land. As they approached civilization, their first encounter with another ship reminded them of their perilous situation. They were a pack of foreign soldiers of fortune attempting to insert themselves in the middle of a civil war. As the unidentified ship approached, the air was fraught with tension. What if it was British? But the ship turned out to be American. But though they posed no threat, they bore a serious warning. 2 Royal Navy frigates blockaded Charleston Harbor. A direct approach on the city was impossible. So La Victoire found an anchorage 50 miles north, off the coast of North Island. Lafayette, DeKalb, and a few others rowed ashore. On June 13, 1777, they set foot on dry land after 54 days at sea. Lafayette's arrival in this land of freedom and liberty could not have been richer with ironic hypocrisy. The first people he encountered were a small group of enslaved Africans crewing an oyster boat. In his youth, haste, and idealistic fantasizing, Lafayette did not yet register the insurmountable contradiction of American liberty and American slavery. As a 19-year-old French aristocrat with a head full of adventurous excitement, Lafayette recognized these African oystermen as merely servants of a master, not property of an owner. And servants were common everywhere. Lafayette would not remain in this blinkered state forever, but for now he remained blind to what he saw. The oystermen agreed to take the Frenchmen to their master, their owner, Major Isaac Huger, an officer in the South Carolina militia and operator of a lucrative rice plantation. They did not arrive at Major Huger's house until midnight, and after a few tense minutes of interrogation to discern whether the strangers were dangerous, Major Huger invited them in to eat, drink, and sleep. Lafayette spent his first night in America on a slave plantation. The next morning, Huger arranged for a local pilot to navigate La Victoire to a safe harbor, but suggested Lafayette and his companions walk overland to Charleston. Warned that escaped slaves lived in secret settlements and survived by stealing from their former masters, the party of French officers loaded themselves with guns and ammunition rather than a change of clothes. Then they departed for Charleston. After 3 days and 2 nights tromping southwest through blazing coastal sands, they finally made it back to civilization. One of Lafayette's companions said they arrived looking very much like beggars and brigands. They were greeted as such. DeKalb attempted to explain they were French officers come to serve in the Continental Army. The residents of Charleston scoffed. The city was full of French mercenaries spinning such tales, claiming impeccable credentials and legendary feats of strength, almost all of them liars and charlatans. Most of these adventurers were inferior officers who migrated up from colonial garrisons in Martinique, Guadeloupe, or Saint-Domingue. While it was true they carried letters of recommendation from their superiors, those superiors happily sung the praises of the most disreputable, drunken, and unreliable men in their units, eager as they were to be rid of them. These shiftless French officers laughed when Lafayette claimed he was a marquis. They heard that story 1,000 times before. The jeers ceased the next morning. A sharp wind blew the 2 Royal Navy frigates out to sea, leaving an opening through which La Victoire entered Charleston Harbor. It turned out the bedraggled strangers told the truth. One of Lafayette's companions said the arrival of the ship caused a complete reversal of opinion about us. We now received the warmest welcome possible, and the French officers, who had been the first to jeer at us, came in crowds to fawn upon the Marquis de Lafayette and try to join his party. Lafayette's group spent the next 8 days in Charleston, dining and drinking with the best of local society. He toured the famous fortification that defended the city so admirably during a failed British siege the previous summer, one of the rare military triumphs in an otherwise dismal year of retreat and defeat. After this inspection, Lafayette grandly pledged enough cash to outfit 100 men, a display of spontaneous generosity reported in newspapers as far away as Boston, who noted with interest the arrival of this rich and generous French marquis. Lafayette and DeKalb believed they were going to sell both the cargo and La Victoire to earn the money they needed to live in America. But young Lafayette signed his purchase agreement without reading or understanding the fine print. He did not know the proceeds from the sale of La Victoire's cargo were earmarked to repay the debt he contracted to buy the ship in the first place. Nor did he know La Victoire was required to load herself with American cargo and return to Bordeaux. Lafayette was forced to take out a high-interest loan to pay his expenses, co-signed by DeKalb, since Lafayette was still a minor. They used the money from this loan to outfit themselves with supplies, clothes, horses, and carriages for the nearly 700-mile trip to Philadelphia. Lafayette envisioned a comfortable ride in a fine carriage through an American Arcadia. This would soon prove to be a pipe dream. A few days after depositing his passengers, the captain of La Victoire commenced the return voyage to France. But as the ship sailed out of Charleston Harbor, she struck a sandbar and sank. Having performed her one historical service of delivering the Marquis de Lafayette safely to America, La Victoire was swallowed by the sea and never seen again. To reach Philadelphia, the former passengers of La Victoire split into 3 groups. Lafayette and DeKalb led one group, Vicomte de Marois led another, while a third elected to make the trip by sea. Though the nautical approach was more dangerous, it was certainly more comfortable. As it turned out, the carriages Lafayette purchased were unsuited for cross-country travel. 4 days into the trip, the axles broke. Lafayette and his companions abandoned the carriages, along with the supplies they hauled, most of which were subsequently stolen. But the horses they now rode were also unsuited for such a long trip. One by one, they pulled up lame or collapsed from exhaustion. The party was forced to detour and purchase new ones. Lafayette kept up a continuous letter-writing regimen during the trip, asking in every coastal town whether ships were leaving for France. Still guided by irrepressible enthusiasm, Lafayette remained upbeat and bore his trials with good humor. "You know that I departed most handsomely in a carriage," he wrote Adrienne. "We are all now on horseback after having broken the carriages. I expect to write you in a few days that we have arrived on foot." Lafayette described America as a glorious land full of magnificent people. Wherever Lafayette looked, he saw egalitarian Republicans of simple homespun virtue. The Americans, he said, were defined by a simplicity of manners, a desire to please, a love of country and liberty, and an easy equality prevails everywhere here. In one letter, Lafayette marveled, "The richest man and the poorest are on the same level, because every individual has an adequate amount of property." In the original paper manuscript of this letter, someone later crossed out young Lafayette's observation, Americans were equal because everyone owned a considerable number of Negroes. This embarrassing remark did not fit with the beliefs of an older and wiser Lafayette, so someone crossed out the line when the family posthumously published his correspondence. His companions were less thrilled by what they found in America. Where Lafayette saw simple goodness, they saw only backward simpletons. They felt acutely self-conscious of the deep anti-French, anti-Catholic sentiment of these Anglo settlers and detected latent hostility in people they encountered. Pierre du Rousseau de Fayolle, a member of Lafayette's party who later wrote a journal of his experiences, observed, "One thing is certain, we have not been flattered with attentions. I do not know whether the future will be better for us, but things are not at all as they were described to us in France." But then again, none of them were a young, rich marquis speaking delightfully broken English with rapturous delight. Neither Lafayette in his enchantment nor his companions in their misanthropy told untruths. Their observations and experiences reflected their own perceptions, beliefs, and projections. But one thing was painfully clear to all of them. The war was going badly. Rousseau de Fayolle said, "The people are not united in a common cause, and I do not think they will ever do anything spectacular." As they trudged wearily toward Philadelphia, they learned the British captured Fort Ticonderoga, sentinel of the northern border with Canada. If they did not hurry, the war might be over before they even had a chance to fight. On July 27, 1777, Lafayette's party arrived in Philadelphia. 32 days after leaving Charleston, 40 days after landing in America, 94 after departing Europe, and more than 150 days since Lafayette bid adieu to his family and left Paris for London. They said goodbye under the assumption he would return within a matter of weeks. Now, many months later, the time had finally come to justify the consternation, pain, disappointment, anger, and doubt he caused in the meantime. But Lafayette's reception in Philadelphia became an even greater farce than his reception in Charleston. The Frenchmen arrived on a Sunday, so the Second Continental Congress was not in session. They first approached the residence of Mr. John Hancock, Boston merchant, ardent patriot, and current president of the Congress. But rather than greeting the officers with open arms and praises to God for the arrival of saviors from France, Hancock informed them brusquely foreign officers were not his responsibility. Hancock told them to go see Robert Morris, the Philadelphia financier, banker, and speculator who sat on the Foreign Affairs Committee under whose direction Silas Deane allegedly operated. Not suspecting anything was wrong, the French officers walked over to Morris's house. Morris was no more accommodating than Hancock. He told them to return the next day to the Pennsylvania State House, where their claims would be heard and addressed. Put off and put out, but not yet realizing the scope of congressional hostility, Lafayette, DeKalb, and their companions found lodgings for the night. The next morning, Lafayette and 13 other officers arrived at the State House, clutching commissions from Deane. All they needed was Congress's stamp of approval and directions to the nearest battlefield. But no one met them. So they waited and waited. Eventually, Morris arrived alongside James Lovell, a stern New England schoolmaster fluent in French. Hardly even pausing to stop, Morris indicated the Frenchmen were Lovell's responsibility. Thoroughly confused, they introduced themselves, but Lovell cut them off and launched into an irritated diatribe denouncing Silas Deane for overstepping his authority. Lovell said Congress sent Deane to get 4 engineers, and instead he sent every French scoundrel with delusions of grandeur he could find, each more pompous, useless, and offensive than the last. Luckily, Lovell went on, Benjamin Franklin secured the needed engineers, who arrived back in April. As no further foreign officers were needed at this time, Lovell said goodbye and walked away. One of Lafayette's shop companions later said Lovell left us after calling us adventurers. But in quintessentially French fashion, the officer noted Lovell did so in very good French. There was nothing they could do but return to their temporary lodgings in baffled confusions. Only later did they discover how much they did not know. First, Dean really had exceeded the bounds of his authority when signing their commissions. Then they learned more about the various French officers who preceded them. These lone mercenaries wore out their welcome, demanding rank and pay well above their station, and treating the colonials like inferior dullards. George Washington was among those sick to death of the influx of French officers. "I have often mentioned to you the distress I am in," Washington wrote John Hancock, "laid under by the application of French officers for commissions in our service. This evil, if I may call it so, is a growing one. They are coming in swarms from old France and the Caribbean." In another letter to Hancock, he pleaded, "You cannot conceive what a weight these kind of people are upon the service, and upon me in particular. Few of them have any knowledge of the branches which they profess to understand, and those that have are entirely useless as officers from their ignorance of the English language." He further begged Major General Horatio Gates, "I shall be much obliged for you to stop the shoals of Frenchmen who are coming." In the summer of 1777, he drafted his latest scathing opinion of French officers. "I have found by experience that however modest they may seem to be at first by proposing to serve as volunteers, they very soon extend their view and become importunate for offices they have no right to look for." He wrote this last remark just days before the Marquis de Lafayette arrived in Philadelphia. As a result of all this, Congress created a new committee to handle applications from foreign officers. They named James Lovell chair of the committee because he was hostile to Silas Deane specifically, and the French generally. It seems Lovell believed his job was to use his very good French to tell arrogant European impostors to get lost, just as he had done with the latest batch who came up from Charleston. Returning home after curtly dismissing the Frenchmen, Lovell wrote a fellow delegate about Deane, saying, "Ought not this weak or roguish man be recalled?" It took a full day for Congress to finally read the letters from Deane accompanying the commissions, as well as letters from Charleston notables confirming the story that the lanky and sandy-haired teenager was, in fact, a real marquis. He was a scion of one of the best families in France. He was an intimate of the Queen. His uncle was the French ambassador to the court of St. James. And best of all, he was rich. The boy could be a major asset in the dream of securing the support not just of penniless French rogues, but the full might of the Kingdom of France. Lovell returned to Lafayette's lodgings accompanied by another French-speaking American named William Duer. Clearly, there had been some misunderstanding. Lafayette confirmed everything said about him. As previous French officers demanded exorbitant pay, they double and triple checked the bit about Lafayette serving without a salary. Lafayette reiterated his pledge to pay his own way. After more back and forth, Lafayette promised to serve under 3 simple conditions. He would serve without pay, he would serve as a volunteer, but he wanted to serve directly under George Washington. If Congress met those 3 conditions, he would happily lend his name, rank, and fortune to the American cause. When Congress debated the matter, they concluded there was nothing to lose and everything to gain. Lafayette's commission cost them nothing, and he might serve as a conduit to the inner circle of French power. They approved his commission. On July 31, 1777, Congress proclaimed the Marquis de Lafayette a major general in the Continental Army. The proclamation made no mention of his military experience, but instead went out of its way to note the rank was bestowed in consideration of his zeal, illustrious family, and connections. In making this appointment, Congress believed they bestowed upon Lafayette an honorary rank for political reasons. Henry Loren, a recently elected congressman from South Carolina, wrote they expected Lafayette to have a short campaign, and then probably return to France and secure to us the powerful interest of his high and extensive connections. But Lafayette walked away under the impression he was now a real general. George Washington, already sick to death of French officers and their grandiose demands, was left to sort out the confusion. The day Lafayette received his commission, Congress held a dinner for Washington at City Tavern. Having just marched down with his army from New Jersey, Washington was in Philadelphia to confer with his civilian masters. Before he arrived, Washington was briefed on the appointment of the curious young French marquis. No doubt chagrined, Washington provisionally accepted the story this Frenchman was different. At the dinner, the two sat at opposite ends of the table, but afterward, Washington took Lafayette aside, spoke to him very kindly, and then told him he should be pleased if he would make the quarters of the commander-in-chief his home, and consider himself at all times one of the family. Washington always referred to his circle of aides and fellow officers as his family. Lafayette took it to mean he was being invited into Washington's personal household. He was thrilled by the unexpected gesture. For Lafayette, this was a seminal moment of his life. It was the beginning of a relationship that would define him long after Washington was dead. Much has been made of the importance of the relationship, especially given the emotional subtext of the childless Washington and the fatherless Lafayette, each filling a hole in the other's heart. For Lafayette, there was a great deal of truth to this. His first would-be surrogate, the Duke d'Enghien, did not exactly pan out. Lafayette still needed a father. But Washington's emotional needs are harder to gauge. He was surrounded by many young men in need of a father figure, and he showed no great urge to be their adoptive father. In fact, Washington's isolating reserve and lack of personal affection were legendary. Lafayette broke through Washington's reserve in a way those who knew the general best considered unique and unprecedented. We know, however, that on the night of July 31st, 1777, George Washington had no idea how much he would come to love this young French nobleman. Lafayette, on the other hand, already anticipated a great friendship. Washington became Lafayette's idol, mentor, and role model, a model promising to balance many of his own impetuous behaviors. Lafayette was naturally excited and excitable. He was passionate, bouncy, eager, intimate, and friendly. These qualities endeared Lafayette to everyone he met in America. They were also traits no one used to describe George Washington. And this is exactly what Lafayette was looking for. He was acutely aware of his own social defects. His clumsy lack of grace and happy effervescence led people to dismiss him and not take him seriously. Lafayette felt indulged and tolerated when he wanted admiration and respect. When he looked at Washington, Lafayette saw a man projecting authority through calm, stoic dignity. It was not in Lafayette's nature to be calm, stoic, or dignified, but with Washington as his model, he would forever try. Lafayette already emulated his new role model in one damning respect. George Washington espoused the cause of liberty while enslaving human beings. He was one of the largest slave owners in North America, and though it is often passed over, we know during these early days in Philadelphia, Lafayette came to own a slave, a, quote, Negro boy, purchased by one of the Americans who sailed with him on La Victoire. The boy was purchased in Annapolis for 180 pounds and used by Lafayette to run errands in Philadelphia. No further reference is ever made to the boy after September 1777. His life after this brief period with Lafayette is a total mystery. For Lafayette, it became another inconvenient fact about his early life he never spoke of in later years. Lafayette spent the next few weeks bouncing between Philadelphia and Washington's nearby headquarters. Invited to review the Continental Army, Lafayette could not help but find them poorly clothed, armed, and disciplined. The French troops stationed at Metz were the only soldiers he knew, and these men were not like those men. Self-consciously, Washington said, "We should be embarrassed to show ourselves to an officer who has just left the French army." To which Lafayette famously replied, "I am here to learn, not to teach." Lafayette said this with evident sincerity. It was probably the first moment Washington realized Lafayette might be more than a nuisance tolerated for diplomatic reasons. But Lafayette also spent these early weeks peppering Washington with requests for a real division to command. Washington was under the impression Lafayette's commission was merely honorary and wrote to Congress for clarification. They confirmed the appointment was honorary. They did not expect the Marquis to actually command troops in battle. Washington called Lafayette into a meeting and said he would not assign him a real command, but Lafayette should still consider himself Washington's son and friend. The commander-in-chief continued to mean this metaphorically. Lafayette took it literally. The orphan Marquis believed he finally found a real home. George Washington's main preoccupation in the late summer of 1777 was trying to figure out what the hell the Redcoats were up to. The movements of the British armies in North America baffled him. General John Burgoyne was presently marching down from Canada. After capturing Fort Ticonderoga, Burgoyne continued moving south from Lake Champlain through the wilderness of New York. Meanwhile, General William Howe, commander-in-chief of all British forces in America, was established in New York City after effortlessly expelling Washington from the city the previous year. It seemed logical, reasonable, and inevitable Howe would head north up the Hudson River to link with Burgoyne. This would detach New England from the rest of the colonies and likely mark the beginning of the end of the rebellion. But instead, in July 1777, Howe ordered his men to board ships and sail away from New York City altogether. They had not been seen since. Washington could not make heads or tails of it. Washington's great mistake, of course, was trying to make sense of the senseless. He did not realize he was witnessing one of the great instances of the British losing the War of Independence as much as the Americans winning it. The British Minister of War somehow managed to approve two contradictory plans during the campaign of 1777. General Burgoyne marching down from Canada and General Howe capturing Philadelphia. The miscommunication among the senior command was so great that as Burgoyne continued his leisurely stroll through the forest north of Albany, which some have taken to calling Gentleman Johnny's party train, he remained under the incorrect assumption Howe's army would arrive to support him. Burgoyne had no inkling of Howe's plan to sail away to Philadelphia. Washington puzzled over a chessboard trying to grasp the hidden trap, little realizing his opponent was simply making a blunder. On August 22, 1777, Howe's army was finally spotted in Chesapeake Bay. Washington rode out to personally reconnoiter the situation and invited Lafayette to come along. Lafayette enjoyed his first action in a uniform, on a horse, and serving a glorious cause. After investigating the British movements, the Continental armies determined Howe planned to capture Philadelphia. Congress begged Washington to fortify the city to withstand a siege, but Washington told them such a project was doomed to failure. The Continental Army would either stop the Redcoats in an open battle, or they would not stop them at all. In the first week of September, it became clear Howe was leading his army on an oblique arc to approach and capture Philadelphia from the west. Washington and his war council decided the best place to halt this advance was at Brandywine Creek, roughly 20 miles southwest of Philadelphia. The Brandywine's swift current afforded only a limited number of crossing points, the most stable of which was Chad's Ford. Here, the banks of the river were enclosed by cliffs and packed with large rocks and solid trees. It was the best possible place to make their stand. September 11, 1777, dawned heavy with fog and anticipation. For Lafayette, this was all his dreams come true. Here he was in America, a major general in an army on the dawn of battle. From the time he was a boy, he planned to become a great soldier, winning glory and fame through courage and daring. Now, the moment of truth was at hand. How would he respond? Would he shrink from the fight, hesitate, run? Would he trip and fall on his face? Would he die? This last question was the most important, but it was likely the furthest from his mind. Not simply because all teenage boys are invincible, but because, as he told Adrienne, being a major general was a great guarantee of living through battle. It's not like he was a colonel on the front line, like his dearly departed father. The Battle of Brandywine ultimately hinged on bad intelligence. In the morning, Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries in the king's employ, approached Chadds Ford as expected. But around noon, Washington was told a second British column wheeled around to the north. Realizing this meant the force in front of him at Chadds Ford was numerically inferior, Washington nearly ordered his men to charge down across the river. But then he was told the second British column was a mirage, so he held back. Unfortunately, the first report was true, the second mistaken. With the clarity of hindsight, it is easy to see Washington's missed opportunity, but in the confusion of approaching battle, nothing is clear at all. Besides, another crucial piece of bad intelligence already sealed the fate of the Continental Army. Despite reports to the contrary, there was another stable crossing further up the river. Washington's army was about to be outflanked. In the late afternoon, frantic word came that a British force previously unaccounted for bore down on the relatively weak Continental right flank. With the battle line shifting, Lafayette requested permission to ride off and join the fray. Washington agreed, either too distracted to realize he was sending this invaluable marquis into the thick of battle, or because he knew the boy needed a real war story to brag about back home to help sell the French government on the merits of the American cause. Whichever it was, Lafayette raced off at top speed before Washington changed his mind. Lafayette rode straight into blistering and noisy chaos. With unruffled nerves, he took stock of the situation and did what he could to bolster the Continental line, crumpling under heavy British fire. He dismounted and physically pushed men forward, calling in his best English to fix bayonets and prepare for close-quarters combat. But the Continental soldiers wanted no part of bayonet duels with the stronger and better-trained British regulars, which would most likely leave them dying slowly on the forest floor from a punctured lung, a pierced heart, or a slashed throat. As Lafayette raced about, a musket ball shot clean through the fleshy muscle of his lower calf. His adrenaline pumping, Lafayette did not even feel it. Only after looking down and noticing blood pouring from a hole in his boot did he realize he was wounded. As dusk descended, the battle was lost. George Washington found the young Marquis forced back onto his horse by an aide, light-headed from a loss of blood and unable to continue fighting. As Washington deployed reinforcements to cover the Continental retreat, he ordered Lafayette to quit the field. Despite his wound, Lafayette continued serving as best he could. With men retreating haphazardly toward the town of Chester, he posted himself at the bridge over a small creek to intercept men in flight. He reformed them to hold the bridge and protect the retreat of their comrades. This is where Washington next found Lafayette. The potentially burdensome young French nobleman, wounded but imposing order amid so much disastrous confusion. Though Washington grappled with the grim embarrassment of defeat, he was impressed by Lafayette's dogged and selfless courage. The boy was not like the others. The Battle of Brandywine was a crucial defeat for the Americans that led to the fall of Philadelphia. The Continental Army inflicted real casualties on its opponent, but absorbed as many losses as it inflicted, probably more. They lost 400 soldiers captured by the enemy, to say nothing of the Pennsylvania militia forces, most of whom ran off, never to return. It was another low point for Washington in what had become a war defined by low points. For Lafayette, the Battle of Brandywine was a great success, a formidable first step onto the stage of history. He accomplished everything he came to do. He passed his test with flying colors. He ran toward battle, not away from it. He stood his ground under heavy fire. He was shot and shrugged it off. His commander-in-chief found him wounded and bleeding, but still struggling to protect his comrades. Since joining the Noailles household, Lafayette seemed destined for inconsequential obscurity, occasionally mocked, but usually ignored. Society even described his admirable decision to run away to America as brilliant folie, brilliant madness. Yes, it was brilliant, but still madness. The most likely result of these amusing dramatics was Lafayette returning home a failure, proving he was indeed a fool. But instead, he succeeded. Brilliantly. At the Battle of Brandywine, Lafayette objectively and incontrovertibly proved himself. The adroitly diplomatic George Washington, himself pleasantly surprised at Lafayette's bravery and sense of duty, welcome virtues in an army of soldiers known for running, hiding, and deserting, paid him public honor. In his brief dispatch to Congress announcing the unfortunate defeat at Brandywine, Washington did not fail to mention the Marquis de Lafayette was wounded in the leg. Washington knew newspapers would publish the dispatch, flattering Lafayette's vanity. It also spread the idea that the interests of America and France were now joined in this dashing young hero, the Marquis de Lafayette. After his wound was bandaged, Lafayette headed back to Philadelphia to prepare for a general evacuation. When Lafayette re-entered Philadelphia, he rejoined his erstwhile comrades from La Victoire. They were still put off by Congress, and many prepared to return home. DeKalb was the only one who made any headway because he spoke English. The other French officers admired Lafayette's exploits. One joked Lafayette's wound would buy more advantages than his entire fortune. Now that he had what he came for, martial glory, a great adventure, and an honorable but non-life-threatening wound, they suggested he come home with them. But Lafayette refused. The blood he spilled at Brandywine was not the end of the story, but the beginning. He now considered himself not just a member of the Noailles, but of the Washingtons. He could not leave now, not when there was so much left to do. From this proving ground beside Brandywine Creek, the legend of Lafayette, the hero of two worlds, was born. Though tales of his exploits would grow, take on a life of their own, and culminate with enshrinement in the pantheon of American history, the legend was not grounded in fiction. It was not a literary invention. It sprang from real personal bravery, determination, and sacrifice. As he said before leaving France, "When I succeed, everyone will applaud my efforts." For anyone else, these might have been famous last words. For Lafayette, they were his opening lines. So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can pre-order Hero of Two Worlds from wherever books can be pre-ordered from. Obviously, your favorite local independent bookstore, but also Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. These are bookstores that are out there in the world that need love too. And if you have found me on Twitter, or I've talked about this a little bit, we do now have, just as of this week, a Google map of all the different bookstores that Hero of Two Worlds has been pre-ordered from. There is a website, you can go to it and just enter your name and where the bookstore is and like what city and state. We're not collecting any information. You don't even have to give us your email address. This is just, I want to keep track of how many different bookstores we are supporting. As of right now, there are hundreds already entered, and we've got all 50 states except for North Dakota and South Dakota. So people in the Dakotas, please get with it. We've got people from all over the world. And I'm looking at the map right now. We've got England, Scotland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan. Hello, Taiwan. I see you. What's up? Ironically, of course, there's no pre-orders from France yet. You know, obviously living there for 3 years, I got a huge following. Anyway, pre-order the book. Good night.